Welcome, dear listeners. There exists a whispered tale, a story of the SandMan. His touch can lead you to blissful reverie or plunge you into the depths of terror. As you close your eyes, you surrender to his capricious whims, never certain whether he will cradle you in serenity or haunt your dreams with chilling dread. Go to bed and wait for the SandMan. Even as it came out of John's mouth, it seemed to him a strange thing to say, and he was not sure why he had. David went to bed. The next morning, though, he asked, "What does the SandMan look like?" Then he sat at the table, his short legs swinging under his chair. "Nothing really," John said. "It's just an expression, just something people say." He put a plate of eggs in front of David and kissed him on top of the head. He thought that would be the end of it until he saw the SandMan for himself. That night, he was getting ready for bed and stopped by David's room to check in on him, as he often did. It was such a routine precaution, but when he saw a pale, naked man sitting on the edge of David's bed, rocking back and forth, it took a moment for him to process what he was seeing. He reacted the way any father would, of course. He ran into the room screaming, and for a moment, he thought about attacking the intruder, but then the man on the bed turned, and that's when John saw that it wasn't a man at all. It was a pale, slithery thing, hairless and with joints turned the wrong way. Its body was out of shape with itself. When it moved, it was like an insane marionette dancing on a stage. John froze. The skittering thing watched him. He felt a spreading warmth, a cold sweat. His heart was pounding in fear. In a second, he realized that David was still there in bed, staring at the broken-shaped thing sitting a foot away. Did he have the courage to move? He grabbed David and ran down the hall. He turned to see if the thing would follow them, but it didn't. For a moment it watched, and then, moving like a stop-motion nightmare, it crawled to the window and jumped out, leaving only the billowing curtains to mark its passing. John had trouble talking to the police. He reported a break-in, but when asked to describe the intruder, he didn't know what to say. How could he make the ordinary man in the blue uniform sitting at his kitchen table understand a thing like he'd seen? He couldn't even understand it himself. To make it worse, David's memory did not correspond to John's. He described an ordinary-looking burglar, a man in a mask, he said. John thought about it. Had it been a mask? No, it would have to have been a full costume, an elaborate one. Something like they would use for a movie, and that would not explain the way it moved. But in the end, he simply echoed his son's testimony. "A man in a mask," he said, "a burglar." The lie unsettled him almost as much as what had happened. The doctors said David wasn't hurt and showed no signs of molestation. John was relieved. They stayed at a hotel for a couple of nights until they felt ready to come home, and then John had a new security system installed, along with bars on the windows. He didn't like the sight of them in David's room, but it seemed like the only thing to do. John was frightened that first night back in the house. But David, strangely, was not. When asked if he felt okay sleeping alone, he just said, yes. In the end, it was John who found himself wishing he were not sleeping alone. He was up all night, listening for the sound of anything moving in the house, although he had convinced himself that his memory was faulty, and that it had been a normal, albeit probably a deeply disturbed man in his son's room. When he closed his eyes for even a moment, he pictured bloodless skin and a twisted, inhuman face. He found himself wandering behind my house. Why my family? He knew, of course, that there didn't have to be a reason, but still, he wondered. 2 weeks later, David stopped talking. John didn't notice at first. Kids go through quiet phases sometimes, but he tried to get David to talk, and he wouldn't. Eventually, it became clear that he couldn't. Back to the doctor they went. "Nothing wrong with him that we can see," was the diagnosis. "Was it the trauma?" John asked. "Could be," they said. "Sometimes these things come on late. Children can be a mystery, even to those who know them best." They recommended a child psychologist who John couldn't afford. He could not, for that matter, even afford the bill they were giving him. Nothing seemed to help. David would write out answers to questions sometimes, but never more than a yes or no. John would then ask him what was wrong, or if he'd seen or heard anything that frightened him. David would only stare. He seemed furtive and bemused. John found himself missing the sound of his son's voice sometimes. He wanted to hear it so bad, but it seemed that David would not talk again until he was ready. John had other things to worry about. He was convinced, beyond reason, that the intruder was not really gone, even though the alarm never went off, and the locks and bars remained undisturbed. He was sure that he heard movement in the night, not normal movements. It sounded like a huge snake slithering through the house. When he heard it, he imagined horrible things, but nothing was ever there when he went to investigate. Though he often thought he glimpsed something just out of the corner of his eye, a pale foot or a misshapen shadow that would slink away as soon as he turned. He rarely slept, and when he did, he had haunted dreams. Soon he realized he had not left the house in weeks, except to go to the bank and buy groceries. He felt hemmed in, with David acting mute. He hadn't had an actual conversation with anyone in weeks, so he called his mother. The connection was bad, and her voice sounded faint, on the verge of not being there at all. "I guess I'm okay, Ma," he said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his palms and making sure he could hear David playing in the next room. "But things have been a little rough. We had a break-in." "Oh, how awful," Mom said. "Did they take anything?" "No, just ran off. It was weird, though. I haven't felt comfortable since then. Are you still working at that hospital?" "No, Ma, I left last year. You've known that." "Oh, well, have you been getting out? What about that nice woman you were seeing last year, the one who played the piano?" John scowled. She was always asking that kind of thing. Didn't she know how hard it was to be a single father? That he didn't have the time? He was about to say so when something made him pause. "Ma, is there anyone else on the line?" he asked. "I don't think so." John was sure he heard it, though. The short, gasping sound of someone trying to hold their breath and failing. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. "You're sure nobody's listening on your other phone, dear?" "There is no other phone. I'm on the cell. That's why the service is so bad." "Then what is it?" John stopped. If the sound wasn't coming from her end, it's from here. He dropped the phone and raced through the hall. The extension hung out on its hook undisturbed. Heart pounding, he hurtled into the garage. The spare phone sat on the workbench, no one in sight. But could they have been? Could someone have been here all along, listening to his phone call and then slithered away? Might they be here even now? The next day, he took out the extra phone extensions, even filled in the jacks with rubber cement. David watched him work, but John offered no explanation. He began giving David a light physical exam every week. His CNA training was a little rusty after a year on disability, but you never really forget. It was an absurd thing to do, of course. Even if there was a physical cause for David's behavior, it would be nothing he could discover this way, and he was aware on some level that it was compulsive behavior. Nevertheless, it made him feel better. One morning, John set the diaphragm of the stethoscope against David's chest, but he could not locate the heartbeat. He moved his hands in search of the right spot to no avail. Then, to test it, he listened to his own heartbeat. It came through steady and clear, but when he checked David again, he didn't hear anything. A thought came unbidden to him, of the Tin Man in Wizard of Oz whose chest was empty as a kettle, a sick feeling or a halt in his stomach. He threw the stethoscope down and grabbed David by the shoulders, looking into his face. David stared back with bright eyes. He even smiled a little at the corners of his mouth. John felt a tingle of tears. He swept his son off in his arms and hugged him, and David hugged back. Then, John put his shirt back on him and sent him to play. The stethoscope, he decided, was broken and he threw it in the trash. But things got worse. John's terrors were no longer relegated to the long hours of the night. Now it seemed that some creeping, skittering and scuttling, some unknowable source, some unknowable noise in the dark corners, filled every second of his day. The thoughts of how big the house really was started weighing on him. There were so many rooms he wasn't in at any given time, so many places someone or something else could be imagined. Strange figures occupying the rest of his home when he wasn't around, melting into the walls or merging with the shadows. When he was not in a room, he imagined it. When he walked up the stairs, he pictured pale faces lurking beneath them. When he went down the hall, he pictured a crawling thing slithering behind the walls, shadowing his every step. If he sat too long in the same chair, he imagined that it was right behind him, and he was never comforted when he turned around and found nothing there, as he could only guess that it had moved swiftly and silently behind him once again, wherever he was not looking. Right now, that was where he imagined it to be. He was losing his mind. He knew it. The only thing that helped him cling to sanity was that David seemed undisturbed. Other than his mutinous behavior, he was perfectly normal. Whenever he seemed to sense that his father was troubled, he would hug him or squeeze his hand or even smile sometimes. When he left the room, John cried. One night, he found himself creeping around the house with no lights on. It was 2 a.m. If the intruding thing had taken to violating his daytime activities, then he would get revenge by confronting it on its own terms. In the night. And the night was no more frightening to him now than the day. They were almost interchangeable. He padded barefoot down the halls, up the stairs, in and out of disused rooms. Sometimes he stopped to listen, hoping to locate it by sound. It was a stealthy, creeping thing, he knew it, and it couldn't always keep its strangely shaped limbs from making their distinct, irregular footsteps. The smallest noise would give it away. There was one room he suspected it spent most of its time in, the spare bedroom. Not a bedroom at all, really, more like a closet, just large enough to accommodate a bed, if one was so inclined. It was unpainted and uncarpeted, and drafty. He'd always meant to fix it up, but he didn't come in there very often because he disliked the bare, unused look of it. It made him think of a partially dissected corpse. He came in, though. If the thing made its nesting in any one place in the house, this could be it. Of course, there was nothing there now, but that didn't mean there was nothing there at all. But what was he missing? How did it hide from him? What was its secret? He peered into the room's empty corners one by one, getting his face a few inches from the floorboards so that he could be certain there was no space for it to conceal itself. The light bulb flickered. He froze. "My God," he said, "it's on the ceiling." He pictured it crawling above him up like a huge pale lizard. That's how it gets around. That's how it escapes anytime I should have it cornered. It just scuffles up the wall and hides right over my head. He imagined it dangling down behind him like a spider. If I turn around, he thought, it will be there, hanging with its face right next to mine. He held his breath. He did not want to turn around, but he had no choice. With a quiet sob, he rounded on his heels, but of course, he was alone. There was nothing on the ceiling. He checked twice. Maybe it crawled out and was waiting for him in the hall. But when he checked, there, again, nothing. It should have been a relief, but it was not. After all, it had to be in here somewhere. If the ceiling was not its trick, that just meant it was something else, something even more strange, even more clever. He went to David's room. He had not stopped to check on him at night like he always had. This time, though, rather than open the door, he listened, pressing his ear against the grain of the wood and holding his breath, terrified that he would hear a skittering sound on the other side of the barrier. What he heard instead shocked him. David was talking to someone. John recoiled for a second, and then, when he'd caught his breath, he kicked in the door. David was already awake indeed, sitting up in bed, but he was not saying anything now. The light flashed on, and John stopped halfway into the room before stopping suddenly, torn. What did he want more? To confirm that his son could speak again, or to find whomever he was speaking to? The creak of the door hinges settled the matter for him. He ran to the closet. He threw it open. There was nothing inside, or at least nothing that shouldn't be there. He swept aside clothes on their hangers, but nothing was hiding between them. Then he dragged a toy box out and emptied it onto the floor. Nothing. He combed along the bare walls and floor, and yes, the ceiling, pushing aside every last bit of rubbish and stray knickknacks so that he could be sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was hiding. All the while, David watched him. After a few minutes, John was panting and covered in sweat, and the closet was bare. There were neither intruders nor answers inside. It struck him as funny somehow, and he started to laugh very quietly. He kicked his son's toys out of the way as he went to sit down on the bed, dazed. He became aware all at once of several things. First, that he had not slept in days and was nowhere near his right mind. The second was how close he'd come to really losing it for good. Tomorrow, he decided, they would both sleep until afternoon. And when they did wake up, he and David would get out of this creaky old house. No more staying up, cooped up like prisoners, and no more checkups, and no more dreams about monsters. He would even take the bars off the windows. It was time to get back to living like real people again. John saw it when he brushed his hand through David's hair. He pulled David a little too roughly closer, and his son acquiesced, though he flinched. What he was seeing was impossible. It didn't feel real. David was missing an ear. No, he realized with mounting nausea. Both ears. There was no injury, no incision, no mark where they should have been, just smooth, blank flesh, as blank as David's quiet, unperturbed demeanor. John swept him up in his arms and ran into the hall. He was not sure where he was going or what he meant to do when he got there. He just knew that there was now nothing more important than getting his son out of that house. But their path was cut off. The naked man sat in the hallway with his back to them. No, not a man, John recognized. Stretched limbs and stooped shoulders, the pale thing squatted on its haunches, rocking back and forth like a tortured soul trapped in an eternal dance of despair. "You invited me?" With a slow voice, it almost seemed to be in pain. John held his son close and backed away. Then he heard David's voice. "Dad." John turned to David and he heard the voice again. "Daddy. Daddy." But David's lips hadn't moved. "Open your eyes, David." David scrunched his eyes shut tighter. "Open your eyes. Open your eyes." David shook his head, trying to refuse, but he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually, his eyelids flickered up, and John saw the truth. David's eyes were gone. John almost dropped him. For a second, he wanted to throw his son down so that he could stop looking into those empty holes in his face. David opened his mouth as if to speak, but of course he had no voice. "He's coming back to be a part of me again." "No. Give him back." "I cannot. It has been too long. I warned you this would happen." "You're lying. You're a liar." "Give me back my son. Give him back. I do not lie. I warned you. He could not exist forever, but you do not remember. You can only remember what I want you to. You forget all the times we have talked." David's body started to feel like a doll, a puppet without strings. His hair was falling out, disappearing before it touched the ground. His hands vanished into his sleeves, and his feet rolled up inside his pant cuffs. John cradled the tiny, shapeless thing. Tears streamed down his face. Soon, he held an empty pile of clothes, and then those too were gone. He looked around the house. Toys disappeared, photos vanished from their frames. David's little shoes were no longer by the door. John turned toward David's room and confronted a wall where the door should be. He groped the blank surface, fingertips scrambling. He hit his head against the wall. The pain didn't feel real. "Why? Why did you do this?" "It was what you wanted, and I learned so much. This is impossible. People will ask. People will wonder. The police, the hospitals, the people in the neighborhood," John shouted. "They have already forgotten him. They only remembered what I wanted them to, like you." John sat on the floor, looking at the blank wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the thing creep toward him and even felt its wet hand on his shoulder. But he did not look at it. "If I don't remember any of this," he said, "then why tell me?" As the story draws to a close, be aware, for the SandMan's presence may still linger in the corners of your mind. So tread cautiously into the waking world, for the boundary between dreams and reality is not always as clear as it seems.